So I'm Lyle, 32M, and I guess you could say I'm at the center of a family drama that I didn't ask for but can't seem to avoid. To set the stage, it all started when my parents passed away unexpectedly. It was a rough time, and after everything settled, I inherited the family home. This wasn't out of the blue. My parents made it clear in their will that I would get the house. You see, I had been the one taking care of them during their final years. Meanwhile, my younger sister, Isabella 29F, was off in another city, living her best life. She's always been the golden child, and it seems that being away didn't change her view of the world or how she treats people. Growing up, it was no secret that Isabella was the favorite. She was the one our parents fawned over while I was sort of in the background. I don't mean to sound bitter, but it was what it was. Isabella could do no wrong in their eyes, and even when she made selfish or manipulative moves, they'd always brush it off. I learned to just deal with it. As adults, we weren't super close. Isabella had her glamorous life in another city, working in finance, and I stayed close to home, taking care of things as needed. When our parents died, the will specifically left me the house. It wasn't a surprise to anyone who knew the situation. I had been the one looking after them, handling their medical appointments, making sure they were comfortable. Isabella had visited sporadically, but she was always too busy to stay long. So when the inheritance was read, it was pretty straightforward. Isabella got her share in the form of assets, and I got the house. A few months passed, and that's when Isabella called me. Her lifestyle had apparently caught up with her. Too many expensive nights out and high-end shopping. She needed a place to stay for just a little while, she said, until she got back on her feet. It didn't sit right with me, but I wasn't heartless. She was my sister, after all. I figured it would be temporary, and I reluctantly agreed. That was my first mistake. The moment Isabella moved in, it was like she'd decided the house was hers. She didn't even try to ease into it. She changed the living room decor within a week, swapped out some of my stuff for things she bought online, and even moved some of my belongings into storage without asking. I'd come home from work and find new furniture in the house, all picked out by her like she was running the place. She started having friends over without giving me a heads up, and it was always at inconvenient times. I let it slide at first, thinking she'd move out soon, but it was getting worse every day. What really pushed me over the edge was how she started dropping hints that we should share the house. She acted like the fact that we were siblings meant she was automatically entitled to half, despite what the will clearly stated. She would say things like, it would only be fair if we both had a say in what happens here, and she'd refer to the place as ours instead of mine. The entitlement was unbelievable. Months went by, and her behavior just got more bold. She'd throw these dinner parties for her friends, turning the house into a social hub, and I was just expected to deal with it. No asking permission, no respect for my space. I'd sit down to relax after work, and boom, there'd be 10 people in the living room, laughing and drinking. It was as if I didn't exist. The breaking point came one night when I came home from work, only to find that Isabella had changed the locks. Yes, you read that right. She didn't even bother telling me. When I finally managed to get inside after pounding on the door for what felt like forever, I found her hosting yet another dinner party. She barely looked up when I walked in. It was like I was the intruder in my own home. That's when I knew I had to do something. I confronted her after the party. I was trying to stay calm, but inside I was furious. She acted like it was no big deal, casually telling me that it would be better if I just moved out. According to her, her lifestyle and friends were a better fit for the house. Can you imagine that? I was the one who legally owned the place, and she was suggesting that I leave. The next morning, I called our family lawyer to make sure everything was in order. I had a feeling Isabella was going to escalate things, and I wanted to be prepared. The lawyer assured me that the house was legally mine, and Isabella had no claim to it. He even suggested I consider starting eviction proceedings if things didn't improve. I didn't want it to come to that, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I tried one last time to make things work. I offered Isabella a compromise. Either she could start contributing to household expenses, or she needed to find her own place. She laughed in my face. She actually refused, saying she wasn't about to pay rent for her own house. That's when I gave her an ultimatum: either pay up or get out. She didn't take it well. She stormed out of the house, telling me she was done with me. I thought that might be the end of it, but the next day, I got a letter from her lawyer. She was threatening to take me to court, claiming she was entitled to half the house. I knew she didn't have a case, but I wasn't about to let her bully me. I decided I'd fight back if I had to, and in the meantime, I started quietly gathering evidence of her behavior around the house. That's when karma started coming into play. Update 1. About a week after Isabella stormed out of the house, I got another letter from her lawyer. This one was more intense than the first. They claimed that living together was causing Isabella emotional distress and made the argument that the situation was untenable. The letter was full of demands, the main one being that I needed to move out of the house immediately. The whole thing felt ridiculous, especially since the house was legally mine, but Isabella clearly wasn't going to let this go without a fight. Things escalated fast from there. Isabella 29F wasn't just relying on legal threats. She started reaching out to family members and mutual friends, spinning a completely different story. According to her, I was heartlessly kicking her out on the streets while she was going through financial hardship. She painted me as some sort of villain who was refusing to help his own sister in her time of need. It was frustrating, but I knew she was playing the manipulation game hard. The first call came from our aunt, one of Isabella's biggest supporters. She was angry and demanded to know why I was being so heartless. I explained my side, how Isabella had been living rent-free, acting like she owned the place, and now had the nerve to change the locks on me. But it didn't matter. Isabella had already gotten to her, and in her mind, I was the bad guy. It wasn't just my aunt either. Other relatives were siding with Isabella, saying that family comes first and I should be helping her out, not forcing her to leave. Despite the pressure from family, I held my ground. And surprisingly, a few mutual friends started reaching out to me with a different take. They told me that Isabella had been telling different versions of the story to different people. Some heard that I was kicking her out, others heard that I was emotionally abusive, and a few even thought I had somehow tricked her out of her share of the inheritance. The lies were piling up, and some people were starting to see through them. A couple of friends even offered me support, saying they could see what Isabella was really doing. In the background, I was working with my lawyer to prepare for what felt like an inevitable court battle. I had all the necessary documents lined up, proof of ownership, the will, and records of the renovations and upgrades to the house that I'd paid for myself. My lawyer reassured me that I was in a strong position, but still, it was hard to wrap my head around how far this situation had spiraled out of control. Eventually, my lawyer suggested we go ahead and file for formal eviction. I hadn't wanted it to come to this, but at this point I saw no other option. Isabella wasn't going to leave on her own, and the longer she stayed, the more unbearable things got. So reluctantly, I agreed to start the eviction process. That's when Isabella took things public. She launched a full-blown social media campaign, painting herself as a victim of my cruelty. She posted these long, dramatic updates about how her brother was kicking her out while she was down on her luck, making her seem like the innocent one. The comments section was a mess, filled with people offering sympathy and support. It was infuriating, but I didn't engage. I knew responding would only make things worse, and besides, I had more important things to focus on. At home, things were getting worse by the day. Isabella, clearly feeling the pressure, started blasting loud music at all hours of the night. She left dirty dishes everywhere and intentionally made a mess of the shared spaces. It was like she was trying to provoke me into reacting, but I didn't give her the satisfaction. Instead, I documented everything. I took pictures, kept a log of her behavior, and made sure I had evidence to present in court if it came to that. Her behavior wasn't limited to just noise and messes. She started inviting more and more people over, turning the house into what felt like a social club. There were nights where I'd come home and find the living room packed with people I didn't know, all of them acting like they had every right to be there. Once again, I documented everything, knowing this could only help my case. Out of nowhere, Isabella made an unexpected offer. She told me that if I gave her a lump sum of cash, she would leave for good. She claimed she was tired of the drama and just wanted what she felt she deserved. The audacity was unbelievable. I wasn't about to give in, especially knowing that this was likely just another one of her manipulative ploys. I told her the money was off the table and that I was prepared to see this through legally. Shortly after that, we received a court date for the eviction hearing. I felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that things were finally moving forward, but dread because I knew Isabella wasn't going to go down without a fight. That's when her behavior took a weird turn. She suddenly became sweet, almost disturbingly so. She started cleaning up around the house, doing the dishes, and even made me dinner one night. It was like she had done a complete 180, but I wasn't buying it. I knew she was up to something. Sure enough, a friend of mine who worked in finance confirmed my suspicions. Isabella's financial situation was even worse than I thought. She was on the verge of bankruptcy and needed the house to keep up appearances. She was playing nice because she thought it might buy her more time. I didn't let on that I knew. I kept quiet, played along, and waited for the court date. It felt like karma was starting to catch up with Isabella, but I had a feeling this was only the beginning of her downfall. Update 2. As the eviction hearing approached, Isabella didn't back down. In fact, she doubled down on her social media persona. Every other day, she posted long, dramatic updates about her homeless future, painting herself as the victim and me as the cold, heartless brother throwing her out into the streets. It was the same story she'd been feeding to our family and mutual friends, but now it was reaching a much wider audience. People in the comments were eating it up, offering her places to stay, and even suggesting they'd help her financially. The sympathy was rolling in. Meanwhile, I kept quiet. My lawyer had advised me to stay out of any public drama, and I wasn't about to make things worse by getting into arguments on social media. But it wasn't easy. I could feel the weight of judgment from people who only knew Isabella's side. Some of our acquaintances were starting to look at me differently, clearly believing her version of events. Still, I kept my head down and focused on preparing for the upcoming court hearing. Out of nowhere, I got a message from Troy, an old childhood friend. Troy used to date Isabella years ago, and while we hadn't spoken in a long time, his message took me by surprise. He told me he'd been following the situation from a distance and wanted to give me a heads up. Apparently, Isabella had pulled similar manipulative stunts when they were together. Troy warned me that she was likely to play dirty in court and offered to testify on my behalf if things got messy. I didn't expect that, but it was a relief to know someone else saw through her act. In the meantime, I kept gathering evidence. Every loud party, every piece of damaged furniture, every time she refused to contribute to the bills or upkeep, I documented it all. My lawyer assured me that this would help solidify my case in court. I didn't want to leave any room for doubt, especially with the way Isabella was playing the victim card so publicly. Through some digging, I uncovered more about Isabella's financial situation. It was worse than I thought. She'd maxed out multiple credit cards, was months behind on rent at her old apartment, and had only moved in with me because she was about to be evicted. She never mentioned any of this to me, of course. She just showed up asking for temporary help, pretending she had it all together. Learning this only made me more determined to see things through legally. As the court date got closer, my lawyer walked me through everything. We had all the documents, the will, proof of ownership, records of the money I'd spent on the house. My nerves started to settle a bit, knowing how solid my case was. But just when I thought things were moving smoothly, Isabella tried one more trick. A few days before the hearing, she approached me, suddenly acting like she wanted to make amends. She claimed she'd been stressed and was ready to settle things privately. She dangled the idea of moving out voluntarily if I'd just give her a few $1,000s to help her land on her feet. It was almost laughable at that point. I calmly told her no, that we'd let the court handle it. She didn't take it well. She stormed off, fuming, and warned me that things were going to get a lot worse. True to her word, she ramped up her smear campaign. More family members were calling me, asking why I was being so cruel. Isabella even went as far as telling people that I'd kicked her out when we were kids, which was a complete fabrication. No one had ever heard that story before, but apparently she was willing to rewrite our history to make herself look more sympathetic. One afternoon, I ran into Mara, one of Isabella's close friends, at a cafe. I braced myself for an awkward conversation, expecting more of the same accusations, but Mara surprised me. She admitted that she didn't believe Isabella's version of events. She said a lot of their friends were starting to see through the lies but didn't want to confront her directly. Mara didn't go into too much detail, but it was clear that Isabella's social circle was beginning to unravel. It was small, but it gave me a little hope that people were starting to see the truth. With all the information I'd gathered, I walked into court feeling more prepared than ever. My lawyer had one last ace up his sleeve, Isabella's bankruptcy filings, which I had found through public records. I wasn't sure if she knew I had that information, but I planned to use it if necessary. The day of the hearing arrived, and Isabella showed up with her lawyer, looking smug and confident. She kept glancing at her phone, clearly updating her friends on the proceedings. I stayed quiet and let my lawyer handle things. The judge went through the paperwork quickly, and it didn't take long for the decision to come down in my favor. The will, the ownership documents, and all the evidence I'd gathered left no room for doubt. The judge granted the eviction request, giving Isabella 30 days to move out. Isabella was stunned. After the ruling, she had a full-blown meltdown right outside the courtroom. She screamed at me, accusing me of ruining her life and saying I'd always been jealous of her. She swore that karma would come for me. I stood there and listened, but I didn't engage. There was nothing left to say. Even though the judge had ruled in my favor, I knew Isabella wasn't going to go quietly. I could sense her desperation. She had 30 days to vacate, but something told me she wasn't going to go down without pulling one last stunt. I had to stay alert. There was still time for her to try something drastic, and I wasn't about to let my guard down. Update 3. With just 2 weeks left before Isabella was legally required to move out, something strange happened. She suddenly dropped all the aggressive behavior. Instead of fighting with me like she usually did, she became almost eerily polite. She started cleaning the house, making dinners, and acting like nothing was wrong. She even went out of her way to be overly friendly, which was a huge red flag. I'd been dealing with Isabella long enough to know that this sudden shift wasn't genuine. She was up to something. My suspicions were confirmed a few days later. I was straightening up the living room when I noticed something odd near one of the bookshelves. At first, I thought it was just another of her random knickknacks, but then I realized it was a hidden camera. It was angled to capture pretty much everything that happened in the living room, especially interactions between us. That's when it clicked. She was trying to bait me into doing or saying something she could use against me in court, probably to delay her eviction or get some kind of leverage. I took the camera down immediately and contacted my lawyer. We documented the discovery, took photos, and made sure the camera was completely disabled. It was another layer to the mess, but at least we had proof of her underhanded tactics. I wasn't about to let her get away with it. Around the same time, I started hearing from people in Isabella's social circle. Her friend Mara, who had already hinted that people were catching on to Isabella's lies, told me that several of their mutual friends had stopped hanging out with her altogether. Apparently, the cracks in her perfect image were starting to show. Her whole social media campaign against me had backfired after the court ruling. People were seeing through her victim act, especially when they realized she hadn't been as honest about the situation as she pretended to be. It wasn't just her friends that were turning away from her. Isabella's financial life was crumbling fast. I found out she had been dodging calls from creditors for weeks, and her car was about to be repossessed. She was sinking, but still hadn't admitted it to anyone. The facade of her successful life was falling apart, but instead of facing reality, she was doubling down on her toxic behavior. Then, just days before she was supposed to leave, things escalated. I came home one afternoon to find that Isabella had completely trashed the house. There was broken furniture scattered across the living room, graffiti sprayed on the walls, and torn-up photos of our parents littered all over the floor. It was clearly an act of revenge, her last-ditch effort to lash out because she knew the end was near. I immediately started documenting the damage. I took pictures of everything, videos too, and sent them over to my lawyer. We agreed that if she didn't pay for the damages, we would press charges. At this point, I had no sympathy left. She'd pushed every boundary and made it clear she wasn't going to leave without causing as much destruction as possible. I confronted her the next day. I gave her a final warning, telling her she needed to leave peacefully and pay for what she had destroyed. She just laughed in my face. Her exact words were something along the lines of, "There's nothing you can do to me that's worse than what life has already done." She was right about one thing, her life was falling apart, and I couldn't do much to make it worse. But I wasn't about to let her drag me down with her. On the day of the eviction, I had a crew ready to change the locks as soon as she was out. Isabella packed up what little she had left and stormed out without saying a word. She didn't try to cause a scene, which surprised me, but I wasn't going to question it. The moment she was gone, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The house was finally mine again. I changed the locks, cleaned up the mess she had left behind, and tried to start moving on. But of course it wasn't over yet. Just when I thought I was free of her, I got a letter from a debt collection agency. Isabella had listed me as a co-signer on a massive personal loan she had defaulted on. It was infuriating. I never co-signed anything for her, and I had no idea how she'd managed to pull that off. I immediately contacted my lawyer again, and we got to work proving that I had no connection to the loan. It was just another desperate attempt by Isabella to drag me down with her financial collapse. As word spread about her situation, more of her friends came forward with their own stories. Apparently, she had been manipulating and using people for money for years. Her social circle was crumbling, and it left her more isolated than ever. Her once glamorous lifestyle was completely falling apart. The final blow came not long after. I got word that Isabella's car had been repossessed, and she had filed for bankruptcy. She'd moved into a small, run-down apartment far away from the life of luxury she'd once flaunted. It was a sad ending for someone who had always prided herself on being better than everyone else. Karma had finally caught up with her. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The house was quiet, and I no longer had to worry about Isabella showing up with some new scheme or trying to ruin my life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't quite the end of the story. Isabella had a way of coming back when you least expected it, and I had a feeling she wasn't done yet. Update 4. After the eviction and court battles, I decided it was time to fully cut ties with Isabella. I had no desire to keep her in my life any longer, and after everything that had happened, it was clear that there was no saving our relationship. I went no contact with her immediately. I blocked her on all social media platforms and refused to respond to any texts or calls she tried to send my way. For the first time in a long while, my life was quiet. With Isabella out of the picture, I began focusing on repairing both the house and my life. The damage she had left behind was more than just physical. The emotional toll of the past year had been heavy, but I was determined to move forward. I spent the next few months fixing up the place, repainting walls, replacing broken furniture, and generally putting things back in order. The quiet of the house was a welcome change, but every so often I would catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting her to come storming back into my life with some new scheme. Despite the peace in my own home, there was still fallout within the family. Some family members, particularly those who had always favored Isabella, refused to believe the extent of her manipulation. They couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that she wasn't the victim she portrayed herself to be. This left me feeling isolated from parts of my extended family, especially those who continued to side with her despite everything. I tried not to let it bother me, but it was hard not to feel hurt by their loyalty to her, even after the court rulings and her outrageous behavior. Just when I thought I was finally done with her, a letter showed up in my mailbox. It was from Isabella. I didn't want to open it at first, but curiosity got the better of me. In the letter, she apologized for everything that had happened. She claimed she had hit rock bottom and wanted to make amends, asking if we could start fresh. It sounded sincere on the surface, but after everything I'd been through with her, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another one of her manipulations. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I shared the letter with my lawyer. He advised caution and suggested I take my time before making any decisions. I wasn't sure what her true motives were, and after all that had happened, I wasn't in a rush to find out. The wounds were still too fresh, and I wasn't about to let her back into my life without a good reason. While I was dealing with that, something unexpected happened. I had reconnected with an old friend, Rowan, during all the drama with Isabella. Rowan had been a steady source of support throughout the whole ordeal, and over time, our friendship turned into something more. We started dating, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had something positive to look forward to. Rowan helped me find my footing again, and our relationship gave me a sense of stability that I hadn't realized I needed. Through this process, I realized how much I had grown from the experience with Isabella. I wasn't the same passive brother who let her walk all over me. I had found my voice, set boundaries, and was prepared to protect what was rightfully mine. It wasn't easy, but I came out of the situation stronger, and that was something I never expected. Meanwhile, Isabella's life was continuing to spiral downward. I heard through the grapevine that she had lost her job. Her erratic behavior at work had finally caught up to her, and without a steady income, she was struggling to keep a roof over her head. While part of me felt a twinge of pity for her, there was also a sense of satisfaction. Karma had finally caught up with her. She had spent so long manipulating and using people, and now she was paying the price. As for me, I continued to repair my relationships with the family members who had supported me through the whole ordeal. I no longer felt the need to defend myself or explain my actions. Those who had stood by me knew the truth, and that was all that mattered. I had survived the storm and come out stronger on the other side. The house felt like mine again, and more importantly, my life did too. But just when I thought everything was finally settling down, one last legal hurdle appeared. Out of nowhere, Isabella tried to contest the will again. This time, she claimed that she had been coerced into signing certain documents, suggesting that our parents had forced her hand. It was a ridiculous accusation, but it meant more time spent dealing with legal issues. My lawyer and I swiftly shut her claims down. We had all the necessary paperwork and proof that her accusations were baseless. It was a last-ditch effort to stir up trouble, but it didn't go anywhere. This was the final straw for Isabella's crumbling case. She had no leg to stand on, and after this, I hoped she would finally let things go. With that final legal battle behind me, I felt a sense of closure. Isabella's attempts to drag me down had failed, and I was ready to move on for good. It had been a long, exhausting process, but I had come out of it stronger and more resilient than ever before. Isabella was out of my life, and this time, I hoped it was for good. Date 5. A few months after all the legal battles ended, something strange happened. Isabella disappeared. I didn't hear from her at all, which was a welcome change, but she also vanished from social media. She had always been so active, constantly updating her followers on her glamorous life. But now, nothing. Even our family noticed that she had cut off most of them. Word eventually trickled back to me that she had moved to a small town somewhere to start over, as one of our cousins put it. I didn't dig any deeper. As far as I was concerned, the less I knew about her whereabouts, the better. For the first time in a long time, I finally felt at peace. With Isabella out of the picture, I didn't have to worry about her showing up at my door or pulling another stunt. The house was mine, and so was my life. I shifted my focus to my career and my relationship with Rowan, who had been by my side through everything. It felt good to have something stable, someone who wasn't constantly bringing drama into my life. I was rebuilding, and for once, things were calm. The house, though, no matter how many repairs I made, it still felt weighed down by all the memories of what had happened. Every room had a reminder of the chaos Isabella had caused. Rowan, seeing how much the house was tied to all the bad memories, suggested something I hadn't considered before. Maybe it was time to sell the family home and start fresh somewhere new. At first, the idea felt a bit extreme. This was the house I grew up in, the house my parents had left me. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The past was heavy, and I was ready to leave it behind. Just as I was beginning to seriously consider selling the house, I got an unexpected call. It was a debt collector, again. I couldn't believe it. This time, it was for a loan Isabella had taken out years ago, long before any of this mess started. Somehow, my name had ended up tied to it. I didn't waste any time. I forwarded the details to my lawyer, and within a few days, he had shut it down before it could escalate. It was a quick fix, but it was a stark reminder that even though Isabella had disappeared, her messes could still reach me. A few months later, Isabella made what I hoped would be her final attempt at contact. I received one last message from her. She claimed that she had changed and wanted to make things right. She said she wanted to come back, to rebuild our relationship, to start fresh. Maybe the old me would have considered it, or at least entertained the idea. But after everything I'd been through, I was fully detached from the toxic cycle. I didn't respond. I had no intention of letting her back into my life, no matter how much she claimed to have changed. With that, I made my final decision. I was going to sell the house. The memories tied to it were just too tainted, and I was ready for a complete fresh start. Rowan was incredibly supportive, encouraging me to leave the past behind and move forward. Together, we started searching for a new home, somewhere we could truly build something of our own. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt like the right one. The house had been my family's legacy, but it had also been the site of so much pain. It was time to close that chapter for good. When the house was finally sold, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't anticipated. Isabella had reaped what she had sown, and now I was free to live my life without her shadow looming over me. No more legal battles, no more manipulations, no more drama. The house was no longer my responsibility, and with that, I could fully move forward with my life. As I closed the door on my old life and prepared to embrace my new one, I took a moment to reflect on the entire ordeal. Sometimes, the people closest to us can become the greatest sources of chaos, and that had certainly been the case with Isabella. But through all the turmoil, I had grown stronger. I had found my voice, learned to stand up for myself, and most importantly, I had learned how to protect my peace. The experience had changed me, but in the end, it had made me a better version of myself. In my final post, I let Reddit know that I had officially moved into a new home with Rowan and was starting a new chapter of my life. I made it clear that I was free from Isabella's toxic influence, and I wasn't looking back. Karma had done its job. She had faced the consequences of her actions, and I was finally free to live the life I deserved. It's funny how things come full circle. What started as a family inheritance had spiraled into one of the most challenging years of my life. But now, standing in my new home with Rowan, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. The drama, the chaos, it was all behind me. And for the first time, I was truly ready to move forward, free from the past. I'm a 32-year-old guy, and for as long as I can remember, my family has struggled with money. Growing up, things were tight. Hand-me-down clothes, bargain bin groceries, and constant talk about making ends meet. My parents, both in their mid-60s now, never really planned for retirement. They scraped by, living paycheck to paycheck, assuming things would somehow work out. Spoiler, they didn't. I, on the other hand, was determined to never end up in that situation. I worked my ass off, got into tech, and now, after years of grinding, I make six figures. It wasn't easy. Scholarships, side gigs, insane work hours. I did whatever it took to climb out of the financial mess I was born into. And for a while, I felt proud of myself. I thought my success meant I could help my family have a better life. But looking back, I realized I was just their golden ticket. It started small. When I landed my first decent-paying job, I didn't mind picking up the check when we went out to eat. Then it turned into covering birthdays, then flights for family visits, then full-blown vacations. At some point, it became an unspoken rule. I was the one who paid for everything. My older brother 35M and younger sister 28F never pitched in, not once. Even when they were working, even when it was something small like groceries for the trip, there was always an excuse. Oh, I forgot my wallet. I'll Venmo you later. Things are just tight right now. It got to the point where even my parents stopped pretending. They'd send me links to vacation rentals or flights without even asking if I was okay with paying. Last year was the worst. My mom found a massive holiday home, beachfront, multiple bedrooms, the kind of place you'd see in a luxury travel ad. She sent the link in the family group chat like it was already decided. This looks perfect. Let's book it before it fills up. My siblings immediately started talking about what dates worked best for them. No one even asked if I was covering it. I was stupid enough to go along with it. The price tag? Thousands. I hesitated, but when I brought up costs, my dad just said, we deserve to have a nice Christmas together. And my mom, well, she got teary-eyed. It's the only time we all get to be together. You don't want to ruin that, do you? So I paid. Again. That trip was hell. My brother and sister treated it like an all-expenses-paid resort. They never cleaned up, never even offered to pick up groceries. The one time I suggested we split the cost of a dinner, my brother laughed and said, man, come on, you make more in a month than I do in a year. By the time we left, I was done. I told myself I'd never do this again. A few months later, as the holidays started creeping up again, I decided to set a boundary. In the group chat, I made it clear, I can't cover everything this year. If we want to do a trip, we need to split costs fairly. The reaction was immediate. My mom sent a long message about how she was heartbroken, that I didn't want to be part of the family traditions anymore. My dad called me selfish. My sister said I was acting rich. My brother, he just dropped a passive-aggressive, wow, must be nice to forget where you came from. Then silence. A few days later I realized I had been removed from the group chat entirely. No explanation. No response to my messages. Just gone. I tried to brush it off. I told myself they just needed time to adjust. Maybe they'd come around. They didn't. Weeks later I was scrolling through Instagram when I saw it. A post from my sister, a group picture, smiling faces. The caption, best Christmas ever, and there it was, the vacation. Same luxury rental style, same kind of trip. Only this time I wasn't in it. They must have saved up throughout the year, or taken out a loan to afford it. Something they never did when I was around to cover the bill. I checked the tags. My parents, my brother, my sister, all there. I scrolled through their posts. Pictures of the house, the meals, the gifts. They went without me. No one had said a word. No invitation, no heads up, nothing. They just cut me out. I texted my mom, asking what was going on. Hours later, she replied, we didn't want to burden you. That's when it hit me. It was never about family. It was never about spending time together. It was about money, my money. And the second I stopped funding their lifestyle, I became disposable. I sat there staring at my phone, remembering all the times I had bent over backward to make sure they had a good holiday, all the times I had covered for them, the thousands of dollars I had spent, and this was what I got in return. I thought about how, even as a kid, I had always been expected to help out more. How my parents had drilled it into me that since I was the smart one, I had a responsibility to take care of everyone. And I realized I had spent my entire life trying to earn their approval, thinking that if I just gave enough, they would finally treat me like family. But they never saw me as family. Just a wallet, so maybe it was time to stop chasing something I was never going to get. Christmas came and went, then New Year's. Not a single text, no calls, no half-hearted Merry Christmas, not even a generic forwarded holiday greeting. Silence. For years, I had been the one making the holidays happen, paying for flights, booking the rental, covering the food, the gifts, the whole experience. And now that I wasn't, it was like I didn't exist. I didn't reach out either. There was nothing to say. Mid-January, my phone buzzed with a message from my brother, first time hearing from him since they cut me out of the family trip. No small talk, no pretense, just straight to the point. Hey man, need a favor. It's kind of an emergency. I stared at the message. No mention of the holidays, no acknowledgement of what had happened, just a sudden reappearance when he needed something. I kept my response neutral. Hope you're doing okay. No offer, no follow-up, just a polite, distant reply. Less than a minute later, another message popped up. Wow, so you're really cutting us off completely. No explanation of what the emergency was. No attempt at a real conversation. Just immediate guilt tripping. I put my phone down. A few hours later, my mom called. Her voice was tight, forced, like she had been holding on to frustration for weeks. I just can't believe you would let things get this bad over a couple of dollars. I didn't say anything. She kept going, switching tactics. Your brother and sister had to scrape together what little they had just to afford that trip. It broke my heart to see them struggling just to have a family Christmas. That got my attention. They scraped together money for that trip, the same trip at a luxury vacation rental, the one where they looked perfectly happy in all their Instagram photos, sipping cocktails and posing on a private beach. I didn't argue. There was no point. Later that night, I messaged my cousin, the only person in the family who wasn't constantly trying to use me. He confirmed what I already suspected. The trip wasn't just the same as the ones I used to pay for, it was even fancier, more expensive, nicer location, higher-end everything. They could afford it. They just never wanted to when I was around to foot the bill. I called my mom back the next day and told her straight, I'm not paying for anything anymore. Ever. She didn't take it well. First, the stunned silence. Then the disbelief. Then the crying. I don't even recognize you anymore. It's like I've lost my son. Then the texts started coming in from my siblings. Long-winded guilt trips about how I had changed, and how they never thought I'd turn my back on family. I muted the group chat. The quiet was strange. I kept waiting for the usual cycle, the emotional manipulation, the sudden let's forget about this messages, when they realized I wouldn't budge. But this time there was nothing. A week later, my cousin reached out. Short message. Good for you. Turns out I wasn't the only one who had noticed how my family treated me. Other relatives saw the way they used me. They just never said anything. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying their financial burdens. And for the first time in years, I felt free. The silence didn't last long. A week after I cut them off financially, my sister started posting cryptic Facebook statuses. Nothing direct, nothing with my name, but the kind of passive-aggressive messages that made it clear who she was talking about. Crazy how some people forget where they came from. Money changes people. Some of us still believe in family over selfishness. The comments were worse. Friends and distant relatives chiming in with sympathy, acting like she was the victim of some great betrayal. You don't need fake people in your life. Someone wrote, family is everything, another person added. I ignored it. Let them talk. Then, I got added back into the family group chat. It wasn't a warm welcome. The second I opened it, I saw paragraph after paragraph from my dad. Long rants about family values and how money should never come between blood. Something about how true success isn't about wealth, but about giving back to those who raised you. My mom jumped in too, talking about sacrifice, how much she and dad had done for me, and how disappointed they were in the person I'd become. Then my brother piled on. It's not about the money, he wrote. It's about how you just threw everything in our faces. I stared at the messages. None of them acknowledged what really happened. That they had used me for years. That they had no problem enjoying vacations and gifts as long as I was paying. But the second I stopped, I was shut out. I asked one question. Why did you go on vacation without me? The group chat exploded. My sister claimed it was never planned that way, that I had isolated myself, that they just didn't think I wanted to go. My mom said they had to adjust since I wasn't paying, and that it was a difficult situation. My dad repeated the same thing about family loyalty, how I should want to help them, how it was my duty, like it was an obligation. I left the chat. Within an hour, my phone started buzzing with texts. My brother, my sister, even some distant relatives, who had clearly been recruited. Family sticks together. You should be ashamed. How can you turn your back on the people who raised you? Then the final message from my mom, after everything I've done for you, this is how you treat me. I blocked her number. My brother and sister followed shortly after. The only person I didn't block was my dad. I told myself it was because he hadn't directly asked me for money, hadn't pushed as hard as the others. But the truth was, I wanted to see if he'd reach out, if he'd say anything different. He didn't. Nothing. No messages. No calls. Just silence. A few weeks later, I booked a therapy session, not because I felt bad about cutting them off, but because I wanted to understand why it took me this long, why I had let myself be guilted into playing their game for years. The therapist didn't tell me anything I didn't already know, that I had been conditioned to feel responsible for them, that they didn't see me as a son or a brother, but as a financial safety net, that their love had always been conditional. For the first time in my life, I wasn't responsible for anyone else's problems. No last-minute requests for money. No passive-aggressive texts about helping the family. No stress about another expensive holiday I'd have to fund. For Christmas I took a solo trip. No five-star resort. No over-the-top spending. Just something simple. A quiet cabin. Some good books. No stress. And as I sat there, no endless family demands. No guilt-tripping messages. I realized something. I didn't miss them. Not even a little. A few weeks after the smear campaign died down, I thought I was finally free. No guilt-tripping texts. No cryptic social media posts. No distant relatives trying to drag me back in. The silence was nice. Then I got a bill in the mail. At first I thought it was junk. Some random company I didn't recognize. One of those fake final notice letters. But when I opened it, my stomach dropped. I couldn't understand how they were still using my money while constantly claiming they were broke. It was for a family phone plan, one I hadn't used in years. The total? Nearly $600. I checked the details. Apparently, I was still listed as the primary account holder, meaning the bill had been coming out of my name this entire time. The charges weren't even mine. Multiple lines. Expensive data plans. Insurance add-ons. My parents had been using my name to keep their phones running, and I had been paying for it without even realizing it. I called the phone company immediately. After some back and forth, they confirmed it. My parents had never removed my name from the account. When I asked why I was just getting the bill now, the rep told me my autopay had been removed last month, which is why the bill was being sent directly to me now. I hadn't removed autopay, someone else did. So after years of paying for their phone plans without knowing, the second I cut them off financially, they stopped hiding it. I called my mom. The second she picked up, her tone was fake sweet, like she had been expecting me to cave and come crawling back. I got straight to the point, asked her why I was still being charged for their phone bills. She acted surprised. "Oh, I thought you knew. You never complained before." I didn't bother arguing. I canceled the entire account right there on the call with the phone company. Every line under my name, gone. Not even 10 minutes later, my brother's name popped up on my screen. I let it go to voicemail. The text came next. "That was Dad's phone. Now he has no service. Hope you're happy." I didn't respond. Instead, I started going through my bank statements. If they had been sneaking this charge under my name, what else had they been doing? I scrolled back years, and there it was, a recurring charge. Same amount every few months. The description was vague, something generic like family emergency fund. It had been coming out of my account automatically. I called my bank, asked for details. It was an account my parents controlled. They had been pulling money out of my account for years. I had never agreed to it, never even knew it existed. The total? Thousands. I called my parents again, asked them directly about it. My mom didn't deny it. Instead, she laughed like it was no big deal. "Oh, we thought you wanted to help. You never said anything before." Like I was supposed to just accept it. I told her to send me the money back. She scoffed. Then came the gaslighting. "It's not like we were stealing, it was for the family. You know we struggle. Why are you making a big deal over a little money?" "A little money? A little money?" I told her straight, "This is theft. If you don't pay me back, I'll take legal action." Silence. Then came the backpedaling. Suddenly, she was in victim mode. "I can't believe you'd do this to your own family. After everything we've been through. You're really gonna turn on us over a couple of dollars." I asked my brother and sister if they knew about this. If they had any idea our parents had been taking my money behind my back. Neither of them answered. Minutes passed. Then my sister left the group chat. My brother responded hours later. His message was short. "We didn't think you'd care. They had known. They had known. And they had let it happen. That was it." I sent one final message. "If any of you ever take money from me again without my consent, I'll go to the police." Then, I blocked them all. Blocking my family didn't end things. It only made them escalate. It started with my brother. He was furious. Full meltdown. Somehow he managed to get my new number and left a voicemail screaming about how I was a traitor and an ungrateful brat who abandoned his family. He didn't mention the fact that they had been stealing from me. Didn't bring up the years I had paid for everything. Just that I was the bad guy now. My sister took a different approach. She sent an email. The subject line? "I didn't know." The message itself was all over the place. She tried playing both sides, acting innocent, like she had no idea our parents were taking that much money from me. She wrote that she thought I didn't mind, and that if she had known the full amount, she would have said something. She conveniently left out the part where she had directly benefited from it. I ignored them both. Then the calls started coming from unknown numbers. At first, I didn't answer, but after the 10th or 12th one in a row, I picked up. It was my parents. They switched tactics immediately. Gone was the angry, guilt-tripping tone. This time my mom sounded desperate. She rambled about how I was making a mistake and tearing the family apart. When I didn't respond, she dropped the act and said, "You don't want to do this. You'll regret it." I hung up. The next day I got an alert from my bank. Someone had tried to apply for a loan in my name. I checked my credit report. It had been run multiple times. I called my bank immediately and froze everything, credit, accounts, anything they could access. I filed a fraud report and flagged the attempted loan as identity theft. Then, I made a mistake. I called my dad. I wanted to hear it from him. If he knew, if he had been involved. If there was any chance he was different from the rest of them. He picked up immediately but hesitated when I brought up the loan. He stammered through some excuse about misunderstanding before cutting the call short. He knew. They all knew. Hours later, I got another email from my mom. No apologies, no denial, just justification. We were only borrowing, not stealing. We were going to pay it back. Borrowing? They tried to take out a loan in my name. That wasn't borrowing, that was fraud. For the first time in my life, I seriously considered pressing charges. I was angry, but more than that, I was done. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control. They had spent years treating me like their personal bank, and the second I refused, they tried to take it anyway. I booked a consultation with a lawyer, not just to protect myself from the fraud attempt, but to make sure they couldn't pull something like this again. I needed to know my options: restraining orders, legal action, anything. While I was dealing with that, my brother took the public smear campaign to the next level. He went online. His Facebook was filled with posts about how I had abandoned family and how I thought I was better than everyone, now that I had money. He made himself the victim, twisting everything. According to him, I had cut them off without warning and refused to help during hard times. None of it was true, but people believed him. The comments were full of sympathy. Wow, I can't believe your own brother did that to you. Money really changes people. You don't deserve this. Then I got a message from someone I hadn't spoken to in years, a random Facebook acquaintance. The message was short. Hey, just so you know, your brother is telling people you stole money from your parents and left them homeless. I laughed. It was the most backwards version of reality I had ever seen. Meanwhile, my cousin, the only family member still on my side, told me something interesting. My brother's credit was ruined. He had been trying to get loans and couldn't because his name was flagged for suspicious activity. I wondered why. Then I found out. He had tried to use my social security number to apply for a personal loan. That was it. I filed a fraud report against my own brother. The fraud report was officially filed. Now it was out of my hands. A few days later, my bank called. The investigation had begun. They confirmed what I already knew. My brother had used my social security number to apply for a personal loan. Multiple attempts, all flagged as suspicious. Because I had reported it early, the financial institution had already rejected the applications. They told me the case would take a few weeks to fully process before any final actions were taken against him. That wasn't the end of it. Since it was flagged as fraud, the bank sent a report to law enforcement. It wasn't just some internal system warning anymore. My brother had committed actual identity theft. Then my phone buzzed. A voicemail. It was my brother raging. His voice was shaking, not with regret, but with anger. He called me every name in the book, screaming about how I was a disgusting excuse for a brother and how I was destroying his life over nothing. Then came the threat. You'll regret this. I saved the voicemail. Not long after, my mom called from an unknown number. She was crying before she even spoke. She begged me to drop everything. She said my brother was going to lose everything because of me, that he didn't mean it, and it was just a stupid mistake. I didn't respond. She kept talking, saying I was the only one who could fix this, that if I didn't, my brother's life would be ruined, that I was punishing my own blood. That's when I cut her off. He ruined his own life. I'm done being his ATM. Silence. Then the sniffles stopped. Just cold, quiet anger. She muttered something about how she never thought I'd turn my back on family. Then the call ended. Hours later, my dad finally reached out. For the first time in months, he called from his real number. I almost didn't pick up, but I did. He had mostly stayed quiet through all of this, never pushing as hard as my mom, but now with everything falling apart, he finally spoke up. He didn't yell. He didn't beg. He just sighed and said, "So this is it. You're really doing this?" Not an apology. Not even a question about what my brother had done. Just disappointment, like I was the one breaking the family apart. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just hung up. And then I blocked them all. For the first time in my life, I had no contact with my family. No guilt-tripping texts. No sudden emergencies. No random calls demanding money. Silence. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I kept going to therapy. One session at a time, I started unraveling years of guilt. Every holiday I had paid for. Every favor that was really just an expectation. Every manipulation. I finally saw it for what it was. They had never wanted me. They had only wanted what I could give them. With them gone, my finances were truly my own for the first time. No hidden charges. No surprise bills. No sudden Venmo requests. That Christmas, instead of stressing about paying for an entire family vacation, I took my own trip. Just me. No obligations. No guilt. No expectations. And it was the most peaceful holiday I had ever had. A month later, I got a letter from my bank. The fraud investigation was closed. My brother was officially flagged in the system for identity theft. His credit, destroyed. His bank accounts, monitored. There was nothing he could do to undo it. And then nothing. No calls. No messages. For the first time in my life, they stopped trying. They finally realized I was done. I deleted them from my social media. No more lurking, no more checking to see what they were saying about me. I stopped explaining myself to extended family. I owed no one an explanation, and just like that, they were gone. No more guilt, no more weight on my shoulders, just peace. And for the first time in years, I realized I was finally free. A full year has passed since I cut my family off. No more bank alerts, no more guilt-tripping texts, no more phone calls from unknown numbers. 12 months of silence. At first I half expected them to find another way back in, to show up at my door, create some new emergency, or beg for one last handout, but they didn't. Instead, they let their actions speak for them. I wasn't checking in on them, but news still found its way to me. A cousin, one of the few people in the family who never bought into my parents' manipulation, mentioned it in passing. My parents were struggling, bills piling up, creditors calling, the financial safety net they had leaned on for years, gone. Without my money, they had to figure out how to survive on their own. And unsurprisingly, they weren't doing well. But I wasn't their problem anymore. My brother, the one who had committed fraud using my identity, his credit was wrecked. The fraud report stuck. Banks flagged his name, loan applications denied. The financial safety net he had tried to steal from me, completely gone. I didn't hear it from him directly. Of course, he knew better than to reach out. Instead, I saw it online. Angry Facebook posts about how some people just don't understand what family is about. He never said my name. He didn't have to. Then, out of nowhere, an email from my sister, subject line, "Can we start over?" The message itself was long-winded. She wrote about how time had given her perspective, and how family should always find a way back to each other. She never apologized. Not once. My cousin had mentioned she had lost her job recently, and I wondered if that had anything to do with this sudden change of heart. She didn't acknowledge the money, the lies, the manipulation, no mention of the fact that she had benefited from my parents stealing from me for years. She wanted a reset, but on her terms. I ignored it. She could rewrite history all she wanted. I wasn't interested in playing along. The crazy thing was, I didn't miss them at all. There was no empty space where they used to be. No guilt, no second guessing. I was free. That holiday season, I didn't sit around wondering how they were spending Christmas without me. I built new traditions with people who actually valued me. Friends who weren't looking at me as an ATM, but as an actual human being. For the first time, the holidays weren't about spending money to make everyone happy. They were about enjoying life. Then came the biggest moment of all. I bought my first home, something I had wanted for years, but had always been discouraged from doing. My parents used to tell me I was too young to settle down. My brother used to joke about how it was smarter to rent and keep money fluid. My sister once casually mentioned that buying a house would make it harder to help them out financially. Translation, they didn't want me putting money into something I could call my own. But now, they had no say. I signed the papers, got the keys, and stepped into my own place, completely free of them. At my next therapy session, I mentioned the house. My therapist smiled and said, "You've broken the cycle." It was true. For years, I had let guilt and obligation rule my life. I had been trained to believe that my purpose was to take care of them, that my success wasn't really mine, that it belonged to the family, but that was over. I had built something for myself, and they had no part in it. A few weeks later, my mom tried one last time, an email. Subject line, "I just want to talk." I didn't open it. There was nothing left to say. That Christmas, I sat in my new home, surrounded by people who actually cared about me. No stress, no expectations, no forced generosity, just peace. A few days later, I saw my family complaining online about money. My brother ranting about how life is unfair. My sister making vague posts about selfish people. My mom dropping Bible verses about forgiveness. Not my problem. I deleted them all. No more checking in. No more curiosity. A year ago, cutting them off felt impossible. Now it felt like the best decision I had ever made. No more guilt. No more obligations. No more being used. I owed them nothing. Cutting off my toxic family wasn't just a choice. It was freedom. A full year of no contact. No guilt tripping. No manipulation. No sudden emergencies. Just silence. Then, out of nowhere, an email. Subject line, "Urgent family emergency." Against my better judgment, I opened it. The email was a mess of dramatic paragraphs. Dad was in the hospital. It was serious. If I had any heart left, I would come see him before it was too late. It was exactly the kind of message they used to send when they wanted to reel me back in. I wasn't going to fall for it. I reached out to my cousin, the only person in the family I still trusted, asked him if he had heard anything about my dad being on his deathbed. It took him less than 5 minutes to reply. Dad wasn't dying. He had a mild case of pneumonia, but was already recovering. He wasn't in critical condition. I sat there, staring at the email. They had lied. Again, I sent one reply. If he was really dying, you wouldn't have lied about it. Then, I blocked the email. The very next day, my brother was back on Facebook. Long-winded posts about how I had abandoned my dying father. How money had turned me into a heartless monster. How some people forget the people who raised them. The comments flooded in. Family members I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly had opinions. Family is everything. You only get one father. Don't let money come between you and love. Distant relatives start reaching out. Then came the direct messages. Random aunts, distant cousins, people who never once reached out when I was being used like an ATM, suddenly had a lot to say. You need to be the bigger person. Your dad doesn't have much time left. You're better than this. I ignored them. Then Mom took things up a notch. She started posting Bible verses on Facebook, stuff about forgiveness and how family is forever. The comment section, full of people telling her to stay strong, and that God would bring me back to my senses. The whole thing was a performance. A week later, my phone rang. It was Dad. For the first time in over a year, he finally reached out. His voice was rehearsed. He told me he didn't want to fight anymore, that he just wanted me to come home. I asked one question, so if I visit, will I be expected to pay for anything? Silence. Then a sigh. We just need a little help. There it was. I pressed him. What's going on? The truth finally came out. They were about to lose the house. They had mismanaged their money again, and now when they were completely out of options, they suddenly wanted me back. I asked one final question. If I didn't have money, would you still want me back? He fumbled, stuttered through an excuse. Then he hung up. At my next therapy session, I told my therapist everything. She didn't hesitate. They only reach out when they want something. That's not love. She was right. I didn't reply. No response, no explanations, just silence. I let them lose their minds. The last email I ever got from my brother came a few days later. It was vicious. He called me the worst mistake this family had ever made. Said he hoped I rotted alone. That was the last thing he ever said to me. I laughed, blocked them all, and took myself out to a fancy dinner. They could drown in their own mess. I was finally free. A month passed. No calls, no emails, no desperate attempts to drag me back in. My family had finally gone silent. Then, out of nowhere, a call from a lawyer. At first I thought it was some mistake. I had no legal issues, no outstanding matters. But when I answered, the attorney explained that my grandfather had recently passed away, and apparently, he left me something in his will. I wasn't completely shocked. He had always treated me differently from the rest of the family, often checking in on me privately while ignoring the drama. Looking back, maybe he saw this coming all along. It suddenly reminded me of the few times he had pulled me aside at family gatherings, shaking his head when he saw how my parents treated me. I never thought much of it back then, but now it made sense. My grandfather was the only one in the family who never asked me for money. He had always stayed out of the drama, never taken sides. I never expected to get anything from him. If anything, I assumed my mom would inherit everything. But then the lawyer told me something that stopped me in my tracks. Grandpa saw through everything. Turns out he knew what my family had been doing to me for years. And before he passed, he made sure they didn't get away with it. He left me a substantial amount. The moment the will was read, my mother erupted. She thought she was getting everything. She had probably already planned how she was going to spend it. But now, a massive portion had gone to the one person she had cut off. My brother wasn't far behind. His credit was already destroyed, and he had been waiting for some kind of financial miracle to fix his mess. When he realized the money wasn't coming to him, he lost it. They tried arguing, demanding answers, looking for loopholes. But the will was clear. The second I left the lawyer's office, I got a text from my mom. Gone was the anger, the fake righteousness. Now, she was suddenly reasonable, understanding. I know we've had our differences, but family should share. She wasn't even trying to hide it. The moment she realized I had something they wanted, I was family again. Not long after, my brother called. His tone was completely different. First he tried guilt. How I didn't deserve the inheritance. How Grandpa would have wanted us to split it. Then, when I didn't respond, he switched to threats. He claimed that if I didn't share, they'd make sure I regretted it. I ignored him. I went straight back to the lawyer. He wasn't surprised. Said this happens all the time when money is involved. His advice? Don't engage. If my family wanted to contest the will, let them, and they did. My mom and brother actually tried to challenge it. They claimed my grandfather was confused when he wrote it, that he had clearly meant for the money to go to the family as a whole. What they didn't know, Grandpa had already anticipated this. He had written the will with a lawyer present, and he had included a very specific clause: anyone who challenged the will would forfeit their inheritance. They had just played themselves. The case didn't even make it far. The lawyer presented solid documentation proving Grandpa was of sound mind when he made his decision. Because my mom and brother tried to contest it, they officially lost their shares entirely. They walked away with nothing. And the best part, I didn't have to do anything. They destroyed their own chances. All I had to do was sit back and watch. A few weeks later, a handwritten letter showed up in my mailbox. From my mom. The message: "We didn't mean to hurt you. Let's start over." It was the same cycle all over again. Now that they knew they couldn't take from me, they were trying to worm their way back in. I didn't even read the rest. I shredded it and threw it away. With the inheritance, I finally had a chance to invest in my own future. I put the money into my savings, into travel, into my home, into things that actually benefited me. And the best part, for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty about it. Cutting them off wasn't just the right choice. It was the best thing I ever did.